Hi, everyone. I'm Brene Brown, and welcome to the Texas Tribune Festival. A couple of the most important things that I've learned over the last few decades of research really have to do with the importance of hard conversations. One, I think we make the most magic out of conversations where there's discomfort and tension, different experiences, different lived experiences, different ideas. The second thing I've learned is the key to staying in those conversations is curiosity. While you're here at the festival, I think there are going to be a lot of hard conversations. And my wish for you is that you lean into them with curiosity. And as my friend Harriet Lerner says, that you listen with the same passion and energy with which you want to be heard.
There you go. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see everybody here. Bienvenidos a Austin. Welcome to Austin, even though I know we have a lot of Austinites, but we also know we have a lot of folks that are not from Austin, including me. So I feel a little bit weird welcoming y'all when I'm not from Austin. Bienvenidos a Texas. Welcome to Texas. And we want to especially welcome today our guests on this panel that I think probably don't need much of an introduction to folks here. We're excited to talk about today the power, the importance of the Latino vote in 2024. It's been something that's been quite a topic of conversation, especially these last few cycles, presidential election cycles, as the Latino community has grown, as the community nationally is almost 20% of the United States and more than 25% of the children in the country. And this year it's estimated by one count that there are more than 36 million eligible Latinos who could be voters. How many of them turn out, where they turn out, who they turn out for, maybe most importantly, is the subject of our conversation and the significance of that. I want to begin by introducing Maria Teresa Kumar, who heads up the Voto Latino Foundation and its sister organization, Voto Latino, which over the years has just done a tremendous job of registering Latina and Latino voters in a number of states, including here in Texas. So thank you for being a part of this, Maria Teresa. Luis Miranda, the head of the Hispanic Federation and I think chair of the Latino Victory Fund, author, and the best dressed person in every room every time. And also, through your work in Latino Victory Fund and the Hispanic Federation, and then over the years serving in mayoral administrations there in New York City, a real familiarity with the Latino vote and its tendencies and impact. And Mike Madrid, recent author of The Latino Century, a Californian, but somebody who is no stranger to Texas and a number of other states on the Republican side. These days, though, not necessarily a fan of Trump, not on the Republican side in this election, but an astute observer of the Latino vote. And for those of y'all that haven't read The Latino Century, I encourage you to pick it up, some great insights. So why don't we get just started with a question about where we're at in this election cycle. Maria Teresa changed candidates on July 21st. Prior to July 21st, I kept seeing all of these polls come out where the numbers were basically almost tied, or maybe President Biden a few points ahead of former President Trump, but nowhere near the high 60s or low 70s that Obama got or Hillary Clinton got or even Biden in 2020 that got in the 60s. Now, looking at it, I see polling where consistently Vice President Harris is running 20 points ahead, 22 points ahead. Where are we right now in this election in terms, do you think, of the Latino community? And then also, with respect to the candidates, what do you make of this candidate change and the effect that it's going to have on Latino voting trends?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, it's wonderful to be back in Austin. Julian is a dear friend, but also has been a counselor to Voto Latino. In the last election, Voto Latino registered and turned out 184,000 Texans, very proudly. And more than 60% of them were under the age of 30. So we deeply believe that in Texas, it's about getting young people to participate. And I will share with you, and I think we had this conversation back in June, it was really tough, what we were seeing in the forecasts. When we did polling, so all of our polling is very much applicable to programs. So we really need to understand the Latino vote, not just opine, but we need to be able to create programs so that they can vote in their interest. And so back in April, we were finding basically, once you introduced a third-party candidate between Trump, Biden, and in this case, RFK, Biden was at 47, Trump was at 38, and RFK was at 12. The moment that there was a switch on July 22nd, so to speak, Kamala Harris was at 60%, Trump went down 29%, and RFK went down 7%. Now, as we were massaging and trying to figure out program, we expected the third-party candidates to go back to the Democratic Party. We expected that. What we were surprised by was the siphoning off of Republican Latinos going to Kamala Harris. And the reason we were surprised, because that was more of a realignment to where the Latino community was around Obama, not the traditional alignment, not under Trump, but a traditional alignment under George W. Bush. And what it said, and these are 2,000 voters in key battleground states. Normally we did Texas, we didn't this time, but it was Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. And the reason we were interested is how do we actually talk to them? And what was really resonating with them above everything else is that they felt that she was meeting them where they were. Among 18 to 19-year-olds here in Texas, the #1 issue is housing. And when we asked young people, well, why housing? You know, sometimes we get into our own bubble and we just assume that the housing was all around trying to save up money to move out of the house or eventually buy your own home. Young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, were trying to figure out if they could budget for a meal or 2 meals a day. And so the fact that just last week, Kamala Harris came out with a policy of building affordable housing, accessible housing, was meeting these same young people where they were. So at first they liked her narrative, the story that they were identifying with, but now they actually like her for the person that she's explaining policy and meeting them. I think where we are in America in the Latino vote is that the Latino vote is absolutely a swing vote, but it's a swing vote very based on how do you have government working for you? How do you have government working and making sure that you're making your ends meet? How do I trust the system works? And so when you look at these policies, they believe that there is a place for government. But if government is not meeting them where they are, then all of a sudden they have a tendency of wanting to tap out. And so what we were seeing in our polls before that was that people were thinking third party, or I'm just not going to participate because it's just too icky. The resonating reason of why not to vote for Trump, they all said that he was just too racist. And if you're asking me why Texas hasn't turned yet, is because you have 800,000 Latino youth that have turned 18 since the last election. And there's fundamental neglect by both parties to engage them at the national level. And you have such talent here in Texas. You have Julian, you have Joaquin, you guys are excellent leaders. You have Lina Hidalgo, you have Cesar Casar here from Austin, you have Mary Gonzalez, you have Cesar Blanco. You guys have a bench. And it's how do we make sure that people realize at the national level the bench that you have? Because what I see when I go and talk to Texans, whether it's in Houston or in El Paso or the Rio Grande Valley, is a desire to be recognized as American, as strong patriots of this country that have a lot to contribute, but that have been incredibly neglected for way too long.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria Teresa. And, Maria Teresa mentioned how critical the Latino vote is going to be in a number of places in different swing states. We hear about basically 7 swing states, 6 or 7 swing states. That's gotten expanded a little bit to North Carolina, for instance, in the last couple of months, Luis. And most people, when they look at that swing state map, they think of places like Arizona and Nevada, where of course there are large Latino communities, largely Mexican American, but there are smaller communities in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. I know that through your work on all fronts that you've become familiar with a number of those communities. And what do you make of the impact that the community may have in these states where we're not thought of as a big part of it, but really when the margins are pretty close, could make a big difference?
Part of the issue with the parties is that for a long time, there were Puerto Ricans in New York, Cubans in Florida, and then Mexicans somewhere between Texas and California. But something that is happening with our community is dispersion. We are 5-6% of the electorate in Georgia, but it's a state where the margin, the winning margin, it's 1-2%. So those are perfect states for Republicans. They don't have to communicate with lots of people, but they want to take at least half of that vote. But the Democrats need 2/3 of that vote in order to swing those electoral votes. And that is happening more and more. Same thing in Pennsylvania, 12%. In North Carolina, 7%. So we are small percentages, but in states where the decision can happen with 2 or 3 percentage points, we become key. And communicating with us, one of the things we do at Latino Victory, it's how do you engage Latino leaders to be validators for others that are running, persuading Latinos, hey, this is a good person for our community, and we need to do more of that. So certainly Arizona and Nevada are key, but in those states where majority voters there, it's how do you begin to communicate with those smaller percentage of Latinos. Next week I'm going to Nebraska, which you don't think about Nebraska as a Latino state.
But they're in Omaha, especially in
Tony's there.
Omaha, there is Tony Vargas, who is running to flip a seat and to get one electoral vote. Because in Nebraska, you could get an electoral vote. So it is thinking about the map and Latinos differently that we have thought about in the past.
Definitely. And speaking of thinking of Latinos differently, Mike,
Mike,
well, and you've had the experience of on the Republican side, but these days, in some ways, for a lot of folks, just as they commonly think of the Latino community, that actually had been moving in the Republican direction after the results in places like South Texas, obviously South Florida with its Cuban American community, Venezuelan American community. As Maria Teresa said, it looks like in 2024 it might be going in the other direction, but just reflect on the Reagan and Bush era and its appeal to the Latino community, and both the opportunity and the danger during the Trump years, and making sense the question that you always get about Latinos, from just folks that ask, they say, like, what in the world is going on? A lot of Democrats, why would a greater percentage in some counties, in South Texas, for instance, turn out at least more for,
and it wasn't just
for the
South
Republicans,
Texas.
for Trump.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
So, and thank you for that. I did was very central to the independent expenditure efforts for George W. Bush, both in 2000 and 2004. I also, incidentally, just full disclaimer, I managed the campaign for Antonio Villaraigosa, who ran for governor in 2018 on the Democratic side, and I'm a co-founder of the Lincoln Project in 2020. Thank you. And I say that because I have literally seen how both parties approach this with their candidates, with their appeals, with their fundraising, with their infrastructures, and they are very different. Although I would suggest, I agree with Maria Teresa, that both parties are really missing the point, so much so that I wrote a book about it. So the answer, I think, you have to understand that and I think we all are keenly aware that the Republican Party now, since 2016, is foundationally and fundamentally different than it was before. I think Liz Cheney just mentioned she and her father, Dick Cheney, are supporting Kamala Harris, as am I.
And
as am
Paul
I.
Aldred.
Yeah. That was, the guy that the Democrats used to consider the Darth Vader of the George W. Bush years now is with the Democrats in this election.
You hear the music going, dun, 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 dun.
Life comes at you fast.
But what I really want people to understand is this. The Latino vote and the Latino voter going forward for the next 25 years is going to be foundationally different than the Latino we have known and talked about politically in this country for the past 25 years, including the messaging, the mobilization techniques, the ground game operations, all of it. It's going to be completely different. And the main reason is because we are, for the first time since I started researching this in the early 1990s, the largest, fastest growing group of our community are third and now a discernible, measurable fourth generation of Latino voters. And you have probably heard quite a bit over the course of the past couple of years, at least since the last presidential election, that there's this racial realignment happening. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe that Latinos who were voting for Obama and Hillary Clinton are now suddenly more conservative and suddenly liked Trump. What I believe is happening is the emergence of an entirely new vote. Almost 40% of our electorate is under the age of 30 years old. That's a jaw-dropping number. 20% of all the Latinos that will vote in November, this will be their first election. And the perspective that they bring primarily as third and fourth generation voters, and I really want to put this in perspective how big it is. This is the explosive exponential growth that is happening now. Only 20% of our voters, only 20% are naturalized immigrant voters. All of these astronomical numbers that you're seeing happening now in places like Nebraska, Tennessee, Montana, and other places, most of this growth is happening with third, again, and fourth generation voters. And they bring in an entirely different, more populist perspective than the traditional right-left spectrum. And it's why both parties and their affiliated groups are completely missing what is happening. The two candidates in American history, recent American history, that have dramatically overperformed both polling and conventional wisdom were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Okay? And that was mostly under the age of 30-year-old voters. And most importantly, they were happening largely in the same precincts. A lot of those districts that went red voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. This is data we have to pay attention to. It's actually data that was found in Maria Teresa's survey work, where there's this rising populist element, which is anti-establishment, anti-party. It's why when Joe Biden was in and RFK was in, RFK numbers were so high. Once Kamala Harris became the nominee, even the de facto nominee, his numbers cratered, so much so that he just got out of the race. There was no point anymore. And that tells you that that mobility of the voters, that fluidity, is something we need to pay attention to. I do not believe that this vote is nearly as swingy as we think it is. If you follow the basic demographic trajectory, the simple math, it's telling you that we as a community are developing, we're maturing, we're evolving. We are following a path that is, the trajectory is not exactly the same way it was for immigrant groups 150 years ago at Ellis Island, but it's pretty darn close. There are differences, the main one being our relationship with Central and Mexico and Central America predominantly, where most of our immigrant groups in our Latino culture are from. But technology has made the ability to reinforce that culture, reinforce language in sometimes. The interaction, I say, and I'll wrap it up with this, but I will say this. 150 years ago, if you were an Italian immigrant sneaking onto a ship to come to Ellis Island and come to America, you were never going back home. You were never crossing the Atlantic. You came here, you found your diaspora in New York, you began a life in your Americanness, and a lot of us go home for the posadas. We're going back once a year, twice a year. A lot of people in this state and in my state in California work across the border. They're going back and forth every day. So this seamlessness has created this different type of transformation that is happening in this country, the likes of which we have never seen, because in 15 short years, America will be, for the first time in her history, a non-white majority country, fueled not entirely, but very much largely by the Latinization of America.
Yeah, and this, I have a feeling that folks have, their own perspectives on this, but some have described Latinos today as sort of the new Italians, so to speak, and that we're on, as a group, this trajectory to basically become a community, I guess if you follow it, the logic of it, that one day, either votes more Republican or it's very close. What do y'all make of that argument?
So I think there's a lot of things to unpack. I think one of the reasons why you saw voters going back and forth between Trump and Sanders was because the populist movement that they were experiencing was that government wasn't meeting their needs. And you have the socioeconomic disparities are very real. And that's what people were yearning for. The reason that we saw a drop for RFK the moment that Kamala Harris came on board was that the volume of disinformation targeting Latinos, on TikTok particularly, about how neither Trump was really doing their business or Biden, but that you should have an appeal for third party, was huge. And now we're seeing that the DOJ is actually going to disclose shortly enough that there was a lot of foreign agents actually behind it. We've been witnessing it. We track all of it. The reason that Kamala Harris appealed so much to young people immediately was that there was not a farm of foreign agents attacking her. Instead, what you saw was a TikTok generation, the brat culture, immediately embrace her and neutralize the misogynistic agenda on the other side. Because yes, people didn't like her laugh or her dance or her voice was too high, but they said she was messy and she was ours. And so when we talk about really trying to understand the Latino voter and the voters at large, it's really understanding that we have increasingly a balkanization of information, of what we consume and who actually targets us. And one of the biggest challenges that I would see when it comes to actually talking to Latino voters about information that they could actually use is that there are nefarious actors on the right and foreign actors trying to encourage us not to participate in the system because they say it doesn't work. And so what we are trying to do is explain to them what democracy means when they do participate. And it sounds like paternalistic, but that's not the case. It's that when you only have 8 states in all of our 50 states that provide civic education in order to graduate from high school, and the disproportionate majority of us are first gen, where are we learning democracy from, right? And that's a real issue. And so while I agree with you, Mike, that we're seeing in the next couple of years where you're going to see people are going to be more available to different ideas of which parties they lie on to, right now, for the majority of young people, they are second generation that are coming up. And they are very much will say, I believe in climate change. I believe that I shouldn't have to duck and cover in my schools. I believe that I should have agency over my body. I believe that if you've been undocumented, you should actually have freedoms. And those are very much aligned with their generation.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party has had a very hard time bridging that. The one issue that we find resonating among the Latino community that is also very real, though, is entrepreneurship. And how do you talk about entrepreneurship so that it's accessible? How is it that you can actually have capital? How do you actually talk about it? Because as you get older, and this is also very true, you don't want to pay the taxes if the taxes are not paying you. And so one of the things that I think that for these young people, they want immediate results. But we also have to recognize that the disinformation that they are receiving constantly is very real. I will tell you, Voto Latino, we are digital natives. To really date myself, we started on MySpace, and we have gone to every single you could chuckle, right? I like to say we're 20 years young this year. But we started in MySpace. We did the very first text messaging campaign back in 2006 before the iPhone. Like, we've been there every single step of the way. We deeply believe in social media. But when I was asked to sign on by an organization to support TikTok, we could not. Because we have actively seen the algorithms that they are using to hurt our community, not just for the democratization and saying that the institutions don't work, but the anti-COVID vaccinations. I mean, it's at a scale that is unprecedented and unregulated. And so when we look at where our political system is, we would be amiss if we don't talk about the disinformation that jarbles people's ability to make the best decision for themselves.
And let me add to what you're saying. A lot of that misinformation comes from our countries of origin. So it's not only the misinformation that it's happening nationally or from foreign agents. But I remember, and we tracked during the height of COVID, the amount of so-called doctors from our countries of origin speaking directly through WhatsApp and TikTok to our community of what to do and not to do. And something that I want to raise that it's not very popular, it's that we are also moving away, and I think that Biden and Trump are the two left, from an older generation of elected officials who looked at politics from the African American and white perspective. We were not part of that equation. So it is harder for both parties to engage with us because their mantra has been totally formed by an African American politics and white politics. And here comes this group that it's different, that has different components, that now 2/3 of them are born here. How do we deal with them when we have never had to deal with them in a real way in the national scene?
Yeah, and just as background to this, Luis, I remember reading an article in the LA Times where Biden, this was from early in his tenure, met with Latino leaders, Latina leaders, and suggested that he did not have as good a grasp of the Latino community in terms of the resonance with it, the history with it, and so forth. One of my first thoughts when Vice President Harris became the candidate was, wow, she's from California, and you cannot succeed in democratic politics in California without having an understanding and working with Latinas and Latinos. You're in California, Mike.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to underscore exactly what was just said because I think this is the most profound part of this transformation we're experiencing. The first chapter of my book is called Beyond Black and White because America only has a racial vernacular politically in black and white terms. And that, I think, has confounded, up until literally just a few weeks ago, the Democratic Party much more than the Republican Party. The Republican Party just went to straight white nativism. Let's just go drive out white, non-college educated rural voters, and that's what we're going to do. The Democrats, even though they do align with a wide variety of our issues on polling, that doesn't explain why there are so many Latinos moving to the right. And what I wanted to know was why? Why, if these issues match up, why is this happening? Because it's quantifiably occurring, and it has been, by the way, since Obama's high point in 2012. This shift didn't happen just in 2020. It's been going on for a decade. And the answer comes back to exactly what was pointed out right now, which is the racial paradigm through which we view our politics does not speak to our community the way that it does for our black brothers and sisters. And yet that's the need to find these issues and discuss them through a racial and ethnic lens is so profound that it has alienated especially the fastest growing segment of our community. And that voter, that third and fourth generation voter, is where you're seeing the shift. That it is a direct correlation between youth who do not see race and ethnicity in the same way, the agreement on the issues with Democrats. And by the way, this is not a new phenomenon with the Democratic Party. Latinos have the lowest voter turnout rate in California, the most Latino state by a wide measure, than any other state in the union, even though we make it easier to vote in any possible way. So we have to acknowledge and accept that it's not partisan. It is a problem of both parties when we don't talk to people about the issues that they want to hear about through the lens that the way they see their lives, our lives. And I think until that's reconciled, we're going to continue to see the lowest turnout rates of any race and any ethnicity in the country. We're going to see a gradual populism on both sides of the aisle, as we have been seeing. And we're going to see, I think, a decline in partisan activity on behalf of the Democratic Party, the same way we've been watching it for the past decade.
Great. I'm going to do a quick time check because the countdown clock that's supposed to be counting down is not.
They want us to keep going. Yeah.
We still have 1 hour.
I can't find my phone, which is
What are
even
you
more
looking for?
worrisome.
What are you looking
But what time is it?
I think we have
45. Okay, we're
15 minutes.
We're going to
still
go
have
for
1 hour.
15 more minutes, and then I'm supposed to read you all this. Says, if you have any questions for one of our panelists, please submit them at texastribune.org/ask. And if you do that, texastribune.org/ask, that'll get it into the queue, and then we'll have a moderated session of Q&A right after this. Maria Teresa, I know that you have something to say about this, about registration and turnout, and sometimes how we look at that. I mean, that's what Voto Latino has been focused on for all of these years.
Yeah, so I think, it's interesting. One of the things that we have seen, that the headlines absolutely scream that Latinos are moving to the right, but their voting patterns don't show that. And even in 2020, when the south of Texas went and voted for Trump, Beto came about and everybody came back aligned, except for District 15. But District 15 by that time had been gerrymandered to be a Republican district anyway. So regardless if you had run a person or a cactus or a donkey, that was going to be a Republican cactus, donkey, or person, right? And so one of the things that we have found, that because that headline screamed that Latinos were moving right, we saw a massive disinvestment, underinvestment in the Latino community come the midterm election. In fact, if you look at Pew Charitable Trust, who I would say is the most nonpartisan, which is always our true north that allows us to better inform our work. In 2018, from 2018, the midterm election of 2018 to 2022, we saw a diminished return on Latino turnout by 37%. 37%. If you looked at who did participate, though, among the Latino cohort, it was voters over the age of 40, disproportionately Republican. And it was because the Republicans got the memo. The headline says, they're going our side, let's invest in the ones that actually do. The Democrats internalized the memo, even though none of the way they were behaving actually came to terms, and they disinvested. I can tell you in a place like Texas, Texas went from the dead last voting state in the country to 42 in 2020. And it was young people that were driving it. And instead of a Texas state legislator embracing young Latinos and young people going to the polls and exercising their right to vote, and who certified a fair, free election, what the state GOP legislator did was slap their hands and pass voter suppression laws that prevented people from registering even in their dorm. And so when I say that Texas is ripe for change, it's because you have a cohort of young people who are what I would say California sensible when California was 25 years ago, right? Like California, where you actually believe that you had agency and your government should work for you, but the government here has put every single obstacle in place. And so if you were to ask me, how do you switch Texas? You overwhelm them at the voting booth. You overwhelm them by registering all the voters and making sure that they don't see you coming, because one of the things that we're seeing is that Paxton was very intentionally purging people from the rolls. You know what they're doing now? They're saying, wait a second, if I purge people from the rolls from the state level, then the Department of Justice, it triggers the Department of Justice, and we can get lawsuits. We don't want that. So they're popping up small nonprofit organizations to go challenge people as independent citizens. You all should be really pissed off. Like, really pissed off. Because it doesn't matter if you're an independent, Democrat, or Republican, the vote is the sanctity of this country. And denying that vote, regardless of your political stripes, should make sure that every single American takes the onus on it and make sure that we are protecting that right. So I encourage you, where you have roughly about 3.5 million young people that are unregistered, under the age of 25, encourage them to participate, because what you are doing here will literally determine the rest of the country.
Let me add Florida to the equation.
Yeah, no, but Florida's an interesting case. And the only reason I say that is Florida, so the schools here in Texas, 52% of them are Latino. You just have, you have such volume of folks, versus Florida is the only state where young Latino voters will never surpass older voters. So we still should pay attention to it, but the possibility is like right here.
But for parties,
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans everywhere have voted Democrat. By large number, in Pennsylvania, 70% voted for Biden, which allowed him to win the state in 2020. But we keep thinking about Florida, but that's where Cubans are, and they are Republican. And when you look at the map, that's where there was an increase on the Republican side, forgetting there's now more Puerto Ricans in Florida than anywhere else in the country, including New York. There is this large population that, with this investment from the Democratic Party and everyone else, have now allowed a new million Puerto Ricans moving into the state to be left to their own devices as to what political front they're going to take. And since most of the registration occurs at motor vehicle, when you go to get your license, you have a third of the Puerto Rican population that has no party affiliation. We're independent. For the first time, it's the party that is picked the most by Puerto Ricans, because voter registration is done at motor vehicles.
Well, and Luis, I mean, of course, you have intimate knowledge of this, and Puerto Rico still travel to Puerto Rico rather regularly and do work there with the Hispanic Federation and other work. And yeah, even this conversation, right? We think about the Latino community, you think about what other country people came from, Mexico or Colombia or whatever, but Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States with its complex relationship.
A colony.
Recently, I was reminded of that complexity. I think it was Mitch McConnell the other day that said, if Democrats are able to run the table and have control of everything, they're going to make D.C. and Puerto Rico the next two states, and they're going to have 4 new Democratic senators. There's an assumption that will always be Democratic.
The next governor of Puerto Rico will be the lead of Latinos for Trump.
Explain that to people that wonder, well, what is the disconnect there?
That
on the island versus here?
We have 2 main parties, and in those parties, they're both Republicans and Democrats. And the faction of the party that is leading now, the existing governor, was a Democrat, and the person who won the primary for that party, it's a Republican who led Latinos for Trump. So the next governor, so thinking that somehow those 7 congressional districts and 2 senators automatically will be Democrats, thank God that still Puerto Ricans don't think about that back in Puerto Rico. But it's important how the disinvestment, it's making sure that important pockets of voters, particularly in the Southeast, which it's where we're going after Maria, it's leaving an entire group of Latinos to use misinformation as the main vehicle to educate themselves. Do they vote? Do they register? Do they don't? Republican, Democrat.
There you go.
Defiende lo tuyo.
And Mike, just sort of dovetailing on that, when we're growing up, when people thought about the Latino vote, well, first of all, after elections, you always hear this one word, and y'all can probably guess what that word is to describe the Latino vote, which is that we're not a monolithic community. If I had $1 for every time I hear a monolith, and I'm probably going to be on MSNBC and say it myself, okay, so don't hold it against me. But you hear that word over and over, right? But that is also, that's true, but it, sort of the center of gravity and the community that moved things in the imagination of people and among power brokers in the country really was the Cuban American community of South Florida. Mm-hmm. Whole policies were changed or not moved on and other things, and really until Obama started opening up relations during his tenure because of the fear of the Cuban American vote. Yeah. Florida really is not a swing state, at least anymore, in this election.
Agreed.
Okay. And so with regard to the Latino vote, you have now, at least in 2 swing states, Arizona and Nevada, as we talked about, largely Mexican-American communities there. And then in these smaller communities in states that are swing states, Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, Central Americans in Georgia, Mexican-Americans in Michigan. Talk about that. How does that affect the psychology of power and who has it within the Latino community, or who drives things, or will it at all? Do people even look at that? I know, just to give a little bit more color to this, when I was running for president, you go to Iowa, and probably you spend more time thinking about different ag policy there because you're in Iowa than you otherwise would. Just like I think people thought more about the relationship with Cuba because that was so crucial. How does it change now that the map has changed?
I'm laughing because you've been in Iowa thinking about those considerations, obviously.
Ethanol.
Right?
Ethanol.
And I remember in 2000, when I was doing the Bush stuff, and we were trying desperately to find Spanish language radio stations because no one had ever put ads in Iowa in Spanish before. We were the first folks doing that. So look, the monolith question, usually people's minds go to country of origin. Let me put this all in perspective. As fast as the Latino vote is growing, it's overwhelmingly Mexican Americans. 60% are of Mexican descent, and it's not that that's that big, it's that no other group hits double digits. And I say that not to be disparaging, because we need to find our commonalities, but it really does lend itself to these strategic considerations, especially cultural competencies. And in every one of the 7 main battleground states, in every one, Latinos will be larger than the margin of victory. In every one of them. It's not just Arizona and Nevada. Wisconsin, we surpassed the African American vote in 2020. Yep. North Carolina has about 3.5% Latino voters, never a subsample in the poll. There's 250,000 Latino voters. That race is going to come down to 45,000 votes. So you can't tell me that the Latino vote won't be determinative. Other groups will as well, but whoever's working that community is going to be determinative in that race. There are, and I've heard this a lot about this cultural competency, and I think I have been saying this since the early 2000s. Republicans ignore this, I think, entirely, because they're just kind of trying to run against the Latino community. Democrats will start to lean into this, but there are not enough culturally competent consultants working in each respective community to make the impact that I think that they need. Okay, I believe that. It's just been my experience having worked on both sides. I don't have faith in the parties anymore. I'm not one of those, I'm out kind of a thing. The parties are not interested in anything other than the parties. I'm clearly making a voting decision this year to vote against what has traditionally been my party because there's no other consideration, there's no choice. But if we think that a party is simply going to be virtuous because it's a party, I think that hurts our community more than helps it. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm Latino. That's my focus. That's my area of concern. I don't need a poll to tell me where I match up or where I don't. I'm going to be a fierce advocate for my community. I'm best at that when I'm speaking to the community that I know. And that shouldn't be a threat to other people. That's how we're going to start getting to a more healthy pluralism. And I think I genuinely believe more than any other year, been doing this for a long time. The only other word I hate more than monolith is sleeping giant, right? We're gonna hear that?
I had that one on my notes.
Those, I think, are really kind of the perspectives of seeing the world as minorities. We need to move beyond that. And once we do, we can start articulating an agenda for our community. And once we do that, I think the parties respond to us. And that's what I think is most important and critical and missing at this moment in time.
All right, let me read to folks that might have a question, because just in a couple of minutes, we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. If you have questions, submit them to texastribune.org/ask. All right.
Is this on? Great. Hey, I'm Darla Cameron with the Texas Tribune. Thank you for your questions. We'll pass them along right now. Maria Teresa spoke about SB 1 and the voter rolls. What about Ken Paxton's raids over alleged voter harvesting and attempts to block county's voter outreach? Is he protecting voter security or trying to disenfranchise Latino voters?
So when someone gets scared, they use every tool in their toolbox to prevent participation. And so what he is, I think, telegraphing, and it's not my think, it's like, as Julian knows, I love data, I love data, I love data. Data does not lie. Everything else can be, but you can't walk away from it. And so what I would say that Paxton is doing, and what Abbott knows, and why they've passed these really hard pieces of legislation in enfranchisement, is that Texas is closer to flip this year than anybody is giving it credit for. And it's because of that they're creating all levers of intimidation, because they're trying to communicate that if you participate, there might be circumstances. I stand in solidarity with LULAC for the work that they're doing. I stand in solidarity with the volunteers, because it is brave to be able to say that we're going to register, we're going to vote, and the fact that we're trying to legislate access to the voting booth that was decided 50 years ago, that's nonsense. And so I do think that what is happening right now is that they're trying to forecast, because there is great fear. And what you do with great fear is that you overwhelm them by participating and having conversations. Because the fact that there are women in Texas right now dying because they have not access to a fair abortion is not a policy debate. You guys are living in a place that is incredibly painful, but you guys are also incredibly bright. I like to say that I'm an honorary Texan. I have family that live in El Paso, and every time I come back, I always see the possibility, because there is grit and resilience in Texas. There's deep patriotism. And what we need to ensure that you are the drivers of this state, but you'll always be the drivers as well. Once you all activate, you'll be the drivers of the country, and that's what they're afraid of. You hold 52 electoral votes. God bless every other smaller state. The reason that the restrictions are so tough is that they see the future that you have and the possibility of driving the country into the next century. And that excites me.
And let me add that the atmospherics nationally have been set up by Trump. And Trump has said, we're not worrying about getting people out to vote. We are worrying about checking what's happened in that voting booth. Mm-hmm. And that means Republicans and MAGAs going into those districts and challenging our votes because of the color of our skin.
That's true.
Thank you. What advice would you give in order to persuade young, registered Latino voters to actually get to the polls?
What advice would you give in terms of to especially young registered Latino voters, and I imagine also maybe folks who aren't registered yet to get registered in the time left to go to the polls? What's your advice to them?
Something that we have done, and I'm sure you have done it as well, that has found to be successful, it's to create posses, to sort of bring people, young people together in schools or colleges that are going to go out and vote together. We have used Starbucks or taco places or places where people meet before making a big of a spectacle and a parade for people to come out to vote. If we were to do more of that, more and more, but at the end, I want to go back to what you said earlier. If we don't teach in schools civic education and the importance of democracy, we're losing the battle.
But I completely agree. Between now and November, I would encourage folks to go to votolatino.org, sign up to be a volunteer. One of the things that we've learned that is successful in getting people out to the polls is by simply taking a pledge and saying, I'll do it, making a plan, adding it to your calendar, and encouraging folks not to wait until mañana, do it as soon as you can. And we've been able to, I like to say Voto Latino, we start off as your cool, hip, older sister, and then once you're registered, we become your sweet, loving, nagging aunt. And we will bother you and bother you and bother you where you finally go and vote so that we don't get a call from me anymore. And as a result, 82% of the people we register cast a ballot. And it's something that we're fiercely proud of, but it's because we're always trying to innovate. We're trying to always understand how it works. And I'll share with you, in a place like Georgia, in 2020, Voto Latino, we registered and turned out 23,000 people. 11,000 were first-time voters. Biden won by 12,000 votes. In Arizona, we registered and turned out 34,000. 19,000 were first-time voters. He won by less than 10,400 votes. It's getting young people in the game to say that everything that they care about is on the line. And I do think that the more people that participate, if you go to New Zealand, if you go to Australia, the more people that participate in our democracy, what you do see is the toning down of extremism on both sides. And that should be the goal.
What might you say to a young Latino voter who's on the fence about voting because the candidates do not reflect their values perfectly?
I'll start. I worked for a Koch in New York 1,000 years ago. He has been dead 1,000 years. And I always remember for my job interview, I was a young guy who made a living of challenging authority. So here I had the biggest authority, the mayor of the city of New York. And I spent my interview saying, and I talk about that in the book, and I don't agree with you on this, and I don't agree with you on that, and finally I imagine he was thinking, why the fuck this guy is here looking for a job? But instead, what he said was, listen, if you agree with me 6 or 7 times out of 10, we're in a good place. Because there's a lot of things that we're going to be able to do together. No candidate is going to be perfect. So we're going to have to figure out what are the most important items in our core belief and who represents those core values, and then we go and vote for those.
And I think going back to something that you said, Mike, is absolutely true. I think for a long time, the Latino community, we have been very faithful to vote with the hope that something happens. And we've discussed this. And we've never come with demands. And I do think that it's time for us to come with demands.
Yeah, yes.
And
Yep.
And it's not because we deserve them, it's because we've earned them. And when you see, and I'll share, and I think you and I talked about this, you know, one of the biggest challenges during the pandemic when people were talking about essential workers, it was for me one of the hardest terminologies to swallow because I was like, essential for who? Because the majority of the folks that were losing their lives were frontline workers and disproportionately in the Latino community. In California, between the ages of 35 to 49, Latinos, 71% of Latinos were the ones that lost their lives in that cohort. We don't talk about the 250,000 orphans that were left, nor the people nor the folks that died. And it was essential for this country. One of the reasons that our economy is thriving and booming is because of the sacrifices that were disproportionately in the hands of the Latino community who did not have choices. And so I do think that what we need to awaken is our need of not just, we're absolutely grateful for being in this country, absolutely grateful for being Americans, but also coming in with demands because that is what we can learn from other communities. And again, it's saying how do we actually level up in that respect?
Can I address it? And we should, again, another round of applause for that. Latinos, we were the essential workforce. I don't know why we're calling it anything other than that. I mean, during COVID, we made it possible for everybody else to shelter in place, to literally protect their lives and their family. And we have not talked enough about those sacrifices that were made. But to the question specifically, there's something romantic about that action. There's something pure and I think idealistic about saying, if I don't agree with them entirely, why would I vote for them? To me, that should almost be the entry point of politics. I don't fear that question. I think it should be embraced because that's the moment you begin to teach them what democracy is. And democracy, look, we've been talking about losing democracy and the threats to the republic since 2016 essentially, obviously a little bit longer, but most directly since then. And I don't mean to diminish that, but let's understand what democracy is. Democracy is a social contract that basically says, I don't get all of what I want. That is literally what democratic action requires. We will all live together and pursue a common purpose and vision with one big, crazy caveat. I don't get what I want all the time. That's the deal you make. That's what democracy is. We have legislators that hammer these things out, and compromise is the point. Compromise is the glue that keeps us together as a country, as a people, as a society. And so the entry point, if that's the entry point of the conversation, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think that's the moment where somebody starts to learn the value of not getting everything that I want. That's what makes a good citizen.
Thank you. Why are Democrats like Michelle Vallejo and Colin Allred coming out with ads saying we need more Border Patrol agents and security, comments that mirror Republican anti-immigrant policies?
And I couldn't hear the question.
Yeah. Why are Democrats like Michelle Vallejo and Colin Allred coming out with ads saying we need more Border Patrol agents and security, comments that mirror Republican anti-immigrant policies?
Happy to start. Poll that we did just a week before your poll showed that, like everybody else, Latinos were the most concerned about the economy. But a very large number of Latinos, 1 out of every 5, were concerned about the border. We're concerned about how their family came through the legal system and saw what was happening as a bit chaotic. The difference between Latinos and others is that half of those people also thought that a path to citizenship was as important as the border. Because we understand that that path to citizenship is a path to citizenship for many of us. So we want to make sure that we have a country and we have commonalities with the rest of the country, but where we are also unique, it's that we want to make sure that there is a path to citizenship, and it's crazy to think that it was a Republican president who I actually didn't like at all, President Reagan, the one who signed the last amnesty bill that I have seen in my generation. And I just turned 70.
Well, and I think to your point of that and the whole idea of making demands, I will share with you, back in May, myself and 4 other Latino leaders met with the president. And we were very frank on what was missing. The Latino community was happy with the student loan forgiveness, but they kept saying, in all our polling, the Republicans at least tell us that they don't want us here. But the Democrats keep lying to us and promising some sort of immigration relief. And so through the negotiations, one of the things that we saw him sign was an executive action in June that provided relief for spouses of American citizens. And that grandfathered close to 2 million people that no one talks about. But it was about going into the White House making demands. What we're seeing now at the border, I think, is incredibly challenging because I think the majority of folks haven't leveled with the American people. I mean, I think one of your policies when you were running was very straightforward. We have not had a Latin American policy for almost 47 years. The disruption that is being experienced right now in Latin America, our allies of vulnerable democracies, is going through the roof. But who has been spending time in Latin America? The Russians and the Chinese. And so if we say that we don't want an open border or that we want a closed border, we actually have to have a frank conversation with Americans with what that means, of making sure that we are providing the necessary infrastructure for people to thrive so that they can continue. And I know that the vice president tried to do that a little bit with Central America, bringing in roughly about $6 or $7 billion in investment into the Northern Triangle. But that's still pennies.
Right.
And so I think one of our conversations that we're going to figure out is like, we are having a Western Hemispheric realignment, and do we want to be a part of it? Because others are.
We're at time. I know you guys can't see a clock. Thank you so much.
All right, let's give it up for our panelists. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you.
I need to figure out where my...
Hey, David. ¿Cómo estás, mi amor?
brother.
How are you, honey?
Oh, here's
Good to see you again.
The bio, but I don't want to mess anything up.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I want South Texas. I have to get it. Hola, mi amor. ¿Cómo estás?
Will you send me the picture of the 4 of us?
¿Cómo estás?
Hey, and
Yeah, I'll go out.
I haven't gotten